everyone. Oh my gosh, it's been a really long time since I made an episode. I know that sometimes it might seem like my music choices don't make a lot of sense for my podcast episode, but this one really fits because we're going to be talking about the dark history of bananas and, more importantly, how that relates to the historic victory that took place last week. So there were two reasons that I chose this song. The first being that the band is called Bananarama, which is not only fun to say, but of course includes the word banana. And second of all, it's talking about a cruel summer, and I feel like that's the perfect way to describe the experience of those who worked for the United Fruit Company, which is now Chiquita, for far too many hours a week with little compensation and very few rights in the grueling heat. So you might be thinking, okay, Athena, why is there this episode on bananas? You've talked about random foods before, like coffee, so why bananas? So there were two main factors that really encouraged me to make this episode. The first being that a long time ago, like probably almost a year ago, I came across an Instagram comment summarizing the slaughter of many unionized workers in Guatemala, or more like workers that tried to become unionized in Guatemala. And I put off reading about it, but it always interested me and I wanted to learn more. And the second, of course, is that I heard about the historic victory that took place last week on democracynow.org. And if you haven't heard about that already, then don't worry about it because I'm going to be talking about it in this episode. But you would have if you followed my podcast Instagram, which, fun fact, is now the Policy-CSR breakdown, all is one word, on Instagram because deconstructing the true impact of corporate social impact was just way too long. So, like I said, I am going to talk about that case, but I'm going to do everything in a timeline from the beginning of the United Fruit Company, took advantage of Latin America's resources, indigenous and poor workers, and of course, its little broken political situation. So, the United Fruit Company was established in 1870 and it remained the United Fruit Company until 1990 when it was then called Chiquita Brands International. It's safe to say that the big investments in Latin America happened after the Spanish-American War ended in 1898. So after this happened, American businesses piled into places like Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, which would hugely impact all of these places, but I'm really going to dive into Guatemala and Colombia today. Actually, starting off with Colombia, and specifically the Banana Massacre, which took place in 1928. So essentially what this was the unprovoked killing of United Fruit Company workers and their supporters in Ciénaga, Colombia. So this all started after October 1928 when a bunch of people issued a list of demands to the United Fruit Company, including wage increases, 6-day work weeks, which is crazy because that must imply that they were working 7, compensation for work accidents, and better health care, things like that. There are two that really stood out to me. The first being a direct contract with the company. And this is really important because if a worker is being abused or overworked or assaulted, they have no right to anything. And more importantly, for the most part, they won't even know their rights. They don't get paid overtime. They don't get paid leave, which I'm sure that no one really got at the time, but that's the best kind of comparison that I can make. And also they were demanding cash compensation because they were getting paid in credit slips and coupons instead of cash and real money. So after this, the United Fruit Company was like, no, we cannot have these losses. And so basically they called up their connections in both the Colombian and US government, which led to these people being villainized, being called communists in the local newspapers. So after this, what I like to call Big Daddy America was like, if you guys don't do something about this, then we're going to have the U.S. Marine Corps, which are stationed right off the shore, do something about it instead. The Colombian government was like, we're just going to cave in. And so really there was nothing too, surprising or crazy except on December 6, 1928, the Colombian army, under the command of General Carlos Cortez Vargas, opened fire on the banana workers who were protesting, including bystanders, leaving us with a huge range of 50 to over 2,000 people dead, which is really interesting. I am going to also post a clip on my Instagram of a painting that depicts the horror of this massacre. It has the victims painted as well as politicians behind the massacre and plenty of other people, so all my art fans should really tune into that because I did a deep dive of like everybody who was in that painting, which is like probably well over at least 30 people, and I found it really, really interesting. So that was the first example, and that was an example of people trying to unionize, people trying to stand up to a company and have better for themselves, work under better conditions, and it failing horribly. So now the next event that I want to talk about stars someone with more political power and prestige wanting better for and advocating for workers, and it's still ending horribly. So that actually took place in Guatemala with the then president Jacobo Arbenz. He was a left-leaning, democratically elected president who started his term in 1951 and really didn't like this whole corporate power taking advantage of Guatemala and its people and its resources situation. So he helped decriminalize labor unions, built public infrastructure to compete with private infrastructure, and most importantly and most dangerously, he advocated for redistributing 1.5 million acres of land to over 100,000 Guatemalan families. And that was the biggest no-no for the United Fruit Company, especially because at one point the United Fruit Company owned roughly 40% of Guatemala's arable land. What I thought was really surprising about Arbenz's approach to this situation wasn't just that he tried to advocate for Guatemalans to get their land back, but he actually tried to negotiate with the company that had been exploiting his people for so long. So he actually offered 1.2 million as compensation for the land that he wanted to confiscate and give back to the people, but ultimately that really wouldn't work out. I'm going to play a clip from a video called The Dark History of Bananas, and it's narrated by John Solori. It's a TED Ed video. Bring back TED Ed. I remember listening to that in like middle school and high school mostly. So it's really interesting, and I'm going to play it now.
In Guatemala, President Jacobo Arbenz tried to buy back land from United Fruit and redistribute it to landless farmers. The Arbenz government offered to pay a price based on tax records, where United Fruit had underreported the value of the land. El Pulpo was not happy. The company launched propaganda campaigns against Arbenz and called on its deep connections in the US government for help. Citing fears of communism, the CIA orchestrated the overthrow of the democratically elected Arbenz.
So yes, this was a really crazy story. Ultimately, Arbenz had to resign because of just threats and opposition from the inside. Instead, a former military officer named Carlos Castillo Artemis became the new right-leaning president, which benefited the U.S., benefited up the profits, benefited the U.S., benefited U.S. profits, and helped reinstall business presence back in Guatemala. I found this case really interesting. I think I first came across it this semester when I was taking my foreign policy class. I've learned about U.S. foreign policy and the CIA basically setting up coups to overthrow mostly left-leaning politicians that were considered a threat, but I never came across an example where it basically happened because of private and corporate interests. Okay, so now with all of that information, I'm ready to dive into the recent event that happened with Chiquita being held accountable for actually paying what the U.S. designated as a foreign terrorist organization. And when I really dived into this case, the first thing that I thought of was the incident with Shell that I discussed on my Instagram page, essentially where Shell paid the Nigerian military to offset and to basically threaten and actually cause damage and kill plenty of people who were in charge of the protests, urging Shell to stop taking advantage and exploiting the resources and the oil that was found in the southern part of Nigeria. So, from 1997 to 2004, Chiquita Brands made illegal payments to the AUC to protect its operations during Colombia's civil war, even after the group was designated as a terrorist organization by the U.S. government. Chiquita claims that it began making these payments after the leader of the AUC at the time, Carlos Castaño, implied that staff and property belonging to Chiquita could be harmed if they didn't get that coin. So they had no choice. Basically, that was their stance. But the plaintiffs were like, no, this can't be right. Chiquita did this because it wanted to expand its presence in the regions that were controlled by the AUC. And this was a long-standing case because the first case was filed in 2007, meaning that it took over 20 years for the families to get justice. And that justice was $40 million to 16 family members of people that were killed during Colombia's civil war by this right-wing paramilitary group. That's in addition to the $25 million that Chiquita had to pay to the U.S. Department of Justice for funding a terrorist organization. Mind you, this is a group that's known for drug trafficking as well as massacring, torturing, and displacing thousands of Colombians. I also wanted to note that there were hundreds of claims against Chiquita, which shows how devastating their funding was to workers and how many more than just these people were killed. In the end, thousands of workers have been killed because of Chiquita's dark history over the years. To this day, non-unionized workers and farmers are more likely to get verbally and sexually abused than unionized workers. I was so excited to learn about this case, especially because this ruling is basically the first time that a U.S. company has been held accountable for abuses committed abroad, and I can't wait to see more of it. Before I end, I wanted to end off with I guess it's kind of a fun fact. So long before it marked the, clothing brand Banana Republic, the term was actually used to refer to authoritarian regimes propped by U.S. companies just like the United Fruit Company. That's all that I have for you guys today. If you haven't, please make sure to follow on Instagram at the Policy-CSR Breakdown, all as one word, and the same for my YouTube. Thank you guys for tuning in, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye!